Hello, my name is Bruce Fenton. I am the author of The Forgotten Exodus, the Into Africa Theory of Human Evolution. And today I'm going to be giving you a fairly short presentation based on my research. The title today is Genetic Evidence for the Australian Origin of Homo sapiens. Now, that's a fairly big, a fairly big kind of statement to make in that title, because obviously that's a suggestion that goes completely against the current common consensus in science as to the origins of Homo sapiens. It's commonly understood that our lineage begins in Africa, most likely East Africa, with the first Homo sapiens arising somewhere in the period between 300,000 to 200,000 years ago. And I say 300,000 because just very recently, in fact in the last couple of weeks, there's been a re-evaluation of fossil evidence in Morocco, which suggests that there were Homo sapiens present there 300,000 years ago. Until recently, the oldest Homo sapiens fossils were in East Africa, and these were at the Homo and Herto sites, and they were dated to around 195,000 and 160,000 years ago, with some contentious views on the earlier dating, based on the fact that perhaps the fossils had moved down into a lower layer and that they were all indeed 160,000 years old. Anyway, so we've seen a re-evaluation of the fossil evidence in Africa very recently. Now, the consensus view, of course, is that these initial Homo sapiens went on to evolve further into modern humans, and that they began to migrate out of Africa around about 130,000 years ago, moving through what we call the Levant region and towards the Middle East, and leaving via sort of northeast Africa, and then making their way across Eurasia and gradually populating the planet. But actually, initially, the first migrants out of Africa, it's understood that they didn't get much further than the Levant region. In fact, that they died off, and that there was a second migration event around about 70,000, give or take, around about 70,000 years ago. Some say a little bit earlier, some say a little bit later than that. And this was the successful migration that really populates the planet and is considered to be the ancestors of all living humans today. Now, that's the consensus view. Now, I'm contesting that, and I've got good reason to. I've collected together a large amount of data, including a lot of anomalies and areas that haven't been fully evaluated. I'd say some very new data, and I've placed that into the puzzle picture, and it's given me a very different view of the evolutionary story of humans. So where do we begin? So redating Homo sapiens. I mean, so when did we really arise? That's a big question. Okay, we know that the fossil evidence suggests that we were around as a species, as early as 300,000 years ago. But we're not relying only on fossil data now. We have genetic studies which help to flesh out this picture, and that's quite important, because in fact it's the genetic data that really has changed our understanding. So first, I'm going to take us away from Africa and off to Europe, and it's there that we find some really interesting fossils which have provided DNA which has since changed our understanding of human evolution. Now, the first important study that we need to know about here was run by the University of Indiana, and this completed in 2013. Now, their aim was to evaluate the fossil record in Europe, focusing on teeth and jaw bones, and to look for evidence of the Homo sapiens ancestors in Europe. Now, it was understood that because European hominins are essentially the same species that we see in Africa in that period, i.e. we have, say, Homo erectus in Europe and in Africa, there's Homo heidelbergensis, this seems to be in both Europe and Africa, that by looking at the European fossil record, we should see evidence of early Homo sapiens somewhere in there, or a species directly ancestral to Homo sapiens in there. And so this project, was done. They evaluated, a very large number of fossils and teeth, and they came to the eventual conclusion that there was no sign of the direct ancestor of Homo sapiens in that fossil record. Now, not only did they come to that, that conclusion, but they also felt that the evidence pointed towards an earlier separation between our ancestors and the last common ancestor shared with the Neanderthals, which previously been assumed to be a divergence event of around 300 or 400,000 years ago. Now, what they found was that the evidence suggested a much earlier divergence, perhaps as early as 1 million years ago, which is incredibly early on in the story. Now, on its own, we might say, well, okay, it's one anomalous result, and that you'd be very cautious with single anomalous dates. But this isn't really on its own as such. We have another study that was running in Spain, which was the sampling of DNA from a fossil site there called the Cima de los Huesos site. And it was basically the pit of bones. So they found a large number of hominin fossils in a pit, which would be a burial, and that these hominins were dated to around about sort of 430,000 years ago. So quite early on in this story, particularly when we're talking about possible divergence 300,000 years ago between ancestral Sapiens and ancestral Neanderthals. So the surprise here was that after they sampled the DNA, and they found that these were not not what they expected. In fact, they actually initially thought they were a new species. Perhaps they weren't Neanderthals or early Sapiens, but were instead something else, which they called the Cima hominins. Now, the other surprise that came up was that they found that there was Denisovan DNA mixed into the genome of these Cima hominins. Now, we'll come back to that, but basically there was another round of sampling that was done. And instead of just extracting mitochondrial DNA, which is just the maternal line, they managed to get nuclear DNA, from which you can find out a lot more about a species. And so they did the full spectrum testing on this nuclear DNA, and this revealed that in fact these were Neanderthals, or early Neanderthals, an ancestor. Yet they were not ancestors of Homo sapiens. And this was kind of surprising because they were expecting that these would be perhaps Homo heidelbergensis, which were long been considered ancestral of both Neanderthals and of Homo sapiens. And instead it turned out that these were not only early Neanderthals, but were not connected to Homo sapiens, and that in fact that they were quite far down in the transition towards a Neanderthal form, and that this in itself pushed back the date of the divergence again. So we found instead of being the possibility of divergence 300 or 400,000 years ago, with these Cima hominins being over 400,000 years old and well on their way to being Neanderthals, it made it quite clear that the divergence had to be much earlier than that. Now, the date range that's been given for that is between 550,000 years ago to around 750,000 years ago. Obviously, that's not quite as far back as 1 million years ago, but when we take into account the study done by the University of Indiana, it gives us good grounds to suspect that the date range that we're looking at, the 550 to 750, it should be the earlier end of that we would look to as our date, because obviously it'd be surprising if the Indiana study was so far out. So I suggest that this is pointing us towards that period of around 700,000 years ago for the initial divergence between the ancestors of Homo sapiens and the ancestors of Neanderthals. And there's more evidence that we need to look at from the Denisovans, which also supports this earlier dating. Now, the Denisovans are a pretty fascinating species, so we will just quickly tackle where they fit into this story. If we move a little bit away from Europe now, we head east, we head into Siberia, we come to a cave site there which is called the Denisovan cave site, and this is the name that's been attributed to the fossils there. It comes from actually the name of a hermit that lived in the cave called Denisova. And basically the small number of fossils found which were of these Denisovans, a piece of a finger, some teeth, not very much, but they managed to extract DNA from these fragments, and it turned out that these were from this unknown species. That they were neither Neanderthals nor Homo sapiens, but they were something else, something closely related, but different enough that they were considered to be a new human species, a new member of our family. The Denisovans had there was evidence within their genome that they were a very ancient species, that they were, potentially older than Homo sapiens, that they had diverged earlier from the last common ancestor, and yet they were closer related to Neanderthals than Homo sapiens are to Neanderthals. So their lineages had stayed closer together for a period and then diverged, perhaps around about 500,000 years ago or so or more. But what we did find there is that amongst the data that came out of the analysis was a suggestion that Denisovans had begun to diverge away from Homo sapiens at least around 800,000 years ago. Now that's pretty interesting, because again we're seeing that support for a very early dating for the divergence of Homo sapiens away from their close relatives, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. So I think we have some strong support for an early dating for this event. Now again, I would suggest that we might look around the 700,000. It's unlikely to be all the way back to 1 million years ago. I think even perhaps 800,000 may be the upper limits, to just how deep that divergence is. But still, 700,000 years ago or so is it's a very long time, longer than was ever imagined in the models and the consensus up until this point. So then, from central Siberia, we have to sort of take a moment to consider, take stock. Where is this ancestor? So if we've already at this point we've hit upon this problem that we're not seeing the fossils of an ancestor in Africa. Certainly at this point, there's only been Homo heidelbergensis suggested as the last direct ancestor, a kind of in between that emerged after the Homo erectus and then Homo heidelbergensis, before becoming what we call archaic Homo sapiens, or Homo sapiens adultu. So when you remove heidelbergensis as a possible ancestor and understand instead that this is an ancestor of Neanderthals and a kind of Neanderthal, this leaves us with an absence in the fossil record in Africa, that we can't say that we have a definitive link to early Homo sapiens there. So this is a problem. Now, in Europe, we've already seen that we don't have this direct link, and we've seen evidence of other human species, and a very early divergence. So there's some really anomalous data that's emerged. At this early point in this presentation, you should already be thinking, this is particularly strange, and it certainly goes against the consensus understanding and likely what most of you would have been taught or have seen in documentaries or read in books. But the Denisovans really, in some ways, are a crucial piece of the data here, because we know that the Denisovans and the Neanderthals were not in Africa. There's no evidence that they were living in Africa. African modern humans today don't have the DNA, or certainly almost no Africans have the DNA of Denisovans or Neanderthals, and in the very small number of cases where they do have it, it's understood to have arrived there much more recently through interbreeding with other modern humans from outside Africa that did carry this genetic signature. Now, we have to ask this question then: where are these Denisovans and Neanderthals from? They're not from Africa. Neanderthals are often thought of as being a European species, but did they emerge in Europe? I'd say no. There's no real evidence to suggest that that's where they first emerged. Indeed, their ancestors, had to have come into Europe from somewhere. Now, we don't have, the hand-in-glove fit that they came from Africa and walked into Europe. It doesn't seem to work like that. And in fact, if you look at the diversity of early Neanderthals, there's higher diversity amongst Asian Neanderthals than European Neanderthals. Now, that's quite strange, because walking out of Africa, it's quite easy to walk sort of from Africa and walk into Europe. It's a strange route to go all the way off into sort of Central Asia, possibly into Eastern Asia, and then doubling back to reach Europe. So there's an anomaly there. And indeed, so Neanderthals should be reconsidered. Instead of being a European species, if they have higher genetic diversity in Asia, then really they are an Asian species, because we're talking about a larger population somewhere in Asia from which these European Neanderthals have emerged. And this is supported again by the fact that we see Denisovan DNA in some of these early Neanderthals, these Sima hominins, because we don't see the Denisovan DNA in later Neanderthals. Now, that's intriguing, because it means that once these Neanderthals were in Europe, they were no longer interbreeding with Denisovans. They were no longer in contact. So these Denisovans were not present in Europe. We know they were not in Africa. So we need to be looking in Asia for the population of Denisovans. And it may be that they weren't interbreeding. This genetic signature we see may indeed be just genetic material which is common to both Denisovans and Neanderthals, i.e. is shared, is seen in the last common ancestor of both, which pushes us back to this population that was living at least sort of 600,000 years ago or so, somewhere else, somewhere in Asia. So as we move through into Eastern Asia, we enter into the area that today is China. We start to see some really fascinating fossil finds there as well, because there's some very early fossils in China that suggest that there were certainly types of Heidelbergensis and what appeared to be early Homo sapiens there, like well over 200,000 years ago. There's a few very intriguing fossils like that which have been identified as possibly Homo sapiens adultu, otherwise Homo heidelbergensis, which are again a bit of a problem for the consensus theory, because we wouldn't, you shouldn't expect to see very early Homo sapiens in China if they're just emerging in Africa, and they're supposedly only emerging in Africa. So this is rather troubling for the theory in itself. But more than that, we've seen some new finds in very recent years, particularly fossilized teeth that have been found in a number of caves across China, and that these have been identified as fully modern. Now, not only are they fully modern, they're very old. In some cases, the oldest collection so far found, I believe, to be around 180,000 years old. Now, when you put that into the context that, until very recently, there's been an understanding that Homo sapiens were only really emerging, 200,000 years ago, now being pushed back a bit to 300,000 years ago, but certainly weren't fully modern, until at least 130,000 years ago, and weren't really, leaving Africa to colonize the world until, well after that, that they barely made it into the Levant 130,000 years ago, and that now we're seeing, fully modern human fossils in China, going back to 180,000 years ago. I mean, this is hugely problematic. There's really, at this point, no sort of mainstream explanation for this, other than that there must have been more migrations, because the bones are there, they have to acknowledge that, but they are not finding the evidence for these migrations. If you look in the Levant region, what you find is the earliest modern human remains there, in sort of the area of Israel and Palestine. You find that there's skulls dated to around 55,000 years ago. Now that's problematic, because we should be seeing, certainly we'd expect to see a larger collection of human fossils in the Levant. If we're seeing two waves coming out, or multiple waves coming out of Northeast Africa, and also from East Africa into the Middle East, we should be seeing fossils there that support these very early migrations, migrations which allow for modern humans being in China at these early periods. Again, and perhaps at least 3 or 4 migrations, because if we have Homo sapiens adultu in China, over 200,000 years ago, modern humans from 180,000 years onwards, then really we should be expecting to see evidence of multiple movements coming out of Africa and moving, eastwards, whether through the Middle East or through the Levant. I mean, this is a problem. There's a lot of missing evidence there. So we have to open the mind a bit and say, can we see, another possibility here, another answer? And the answer is yes. We can say that there's the possibility instead that Homo sapiens evolution is largely happening elsewhere, outside of Africa, particularly in Southeast Asia, in this region that we're moving into now. Now, the Chinese scientists, of course, are claiming that Homo sapiens may have evolved in China, and that we should be looking there as the true home of our species. Now, I don't really agree with that. I can understand the argument. They have some of they have certainly the oldest fossils of modern humans, but there's a little bit more to this than meets the eye, because you still have to explain these other cousin species and their emergence, and really sort of locate where this is happening. Where are the populations, the ancestral populations for Neanderthals and Denisovans, as well as for Homo sapiens. And there's one very respected paleoanthropologist has recently said we should probably be looking for an ancestral population that lived around 700,000 to 900,000 years ago to ensure that we're looking at the true ancestor of these these populations. And we haven't found that population so far. We haven't seen it in Europe, we haven't seen it in Africa, we haven't seen it in Central Asia. So it really narrows down the field, to where we can find this ancestor. And the real clue here is the Denisovan genetics, because although we see Denisovan fossils up in Siberia, in fact, so far the only positively identified Denisovan fossils are those from the Denisova cave. Partly because fossils found in China, which may well be Denisovans, have not produced viable DNA. So at present we say, okay, we've only found the fossils there. So there's an argument that's been made that the Denisovans are a Central Asian species. Now this is rather simplistic, because just because one or two Denisovans ended up in a cave in Central Asia doesn't mean that that's their homeland. We know that humans are able to walk around, they travel, they explore, they migrate. We can't assume that that's the population center. And one way to deduce where the population center is to look at the genetic signature. And so testing was done. They looked at the local population today of modern humans in that area, and they found no sign of Denisovan genetics. They tested people in Europe, they found that there was no sign. And indeed, they carried on, expanding this, the region in which to look, throughout Asia. And eventually they found that, as you move down into East Asia, you get a signature there. About 0.1% of the modern human genome amongst people in East Asia is Denisovan. And as you move further to the southeast, this signature rises slightly. And certainly as you move towards Indonesia, there's a higher signature of Denisovan genetics. Now this would suggest you're moving towards the greatest population center, where there's been the highest levels of interbreeding and the highest remnant signature of a large population. The incredible thing is, though, we really don't see a very high level of their genetics in modern humans until we cross the Wallace Line, which is a geographic border between Southeast Asia and Australasia, which passes basically across some of the small Indonesian islands, like Flores, for example, which come on to now, because it's been, as most of you will know, that in the last few years, hominins were found living on a hominin species was found to have been living on Flores, and it's been given the name Homo floresiensis, or the hobbits, and that's because these were diminutive, very small hominins, up to just over a meter in height, hence the name hobbits, because they were quite unlike us. They had archaic features. They looked rather what we call today, I suppose, primitive, but certainly they looked like they were closer related to earlier hominins than to modern humans. Mine is very small, obviously small-brained, and so quite peculiar, and that they were living on Flores, is in itself anomalous, because Flores, can't be reached by any other way than crossing water. Now, I've seen a lot of people saying, but once long ago, the sea levels were, much lower, and that possibly these hominins walked to the island. Now, this is a misunderstanding, because although yes, the sea levels were much lower, they've been 100 meters or so lower. At no time could you simply walk to Flores. Flores is surrounded by deep ocean trenches, which means it's always cut off by the ocean. And there's very strong currents that move through this area, which is why it's the border, the natural border between Australasia and Southeast Asia. It's because you have the ocean basically moving to the southwest between these islands. Colossal current, colossally powerful currents pulling, anything that falls into the water, pulling it off to the southwest and away from the islands on the side or the continent on the other side. So not much has made it across. A few small mammals, a few plant species, have managed to end up on opposite sides of this line over vast periods of time, probably carried by specific events. A storm might carry seeds, across, or a small mammal like a rat, may end up on a log that floats across. Now we understand that this does sometimes happen. However, for the most part, larger mammals have not managed to cross this divide. Now we only see this a million years ago. We see the first evidence that hominins have managed to cross the Wallace Line, and this comes in the form of stone tools found on Flores. Now we can't be sure whether or not these were tools used by the hobbits, or whether they were tools used by something else, perhaps Homo erectus. Now, Homo erectus was in Indonesia, mostly on Java, and been there for hundreds of thousands of years. Possibly, in that region for at least, well, almost 2 million years, in understanding. There's fossil evidence that puts Homo erectus in Asia and Southeast Asia around about 1.8 million years ago and onwards. So there's, it's been in that region for a fair amount of time. We can imagine that in that 800,000 years, that some of these erectors have created the first rafts. Maybe something as simple as bamboo tied together with some natural vines. And this is feared to be the most likely type of watercraft would be used. Because the material for it is so abundant there in the region that to harvest bamboo, and also to see the water, the properties of bamboo and water. It's quite evident. You see bamboo floating in a river. It's a common sight in Southeast Asia. So they would have seen this, and so we can kind of understand how this would have come about. Certainly in hundreds of thousands of years, that somebody may well have just come to the understanding that if you put a few of these bamboo pieces together, that you can float. It doesn't take any sort of great engineering know-how. It does take some higher thinking, of course. And also we'd wonder, does it not require some sort of organizational skills? Perhaps language, rudimentary language, whether that's sign language of some sort, or, as I theorize, perhaps a click and whistle based language, which is the most archaic form of language that we know today, which is actually still spoken by the Khoisan peoples in sub-Saharan Africa. Languages that are a mix of hand gestures, click sounds, whistling, emulated animal noises. These languages don't require a fully developed vocal system in the body, and can be produced by early hominins. So it may well be that we're seeing here not only the first evidence of engineering, making a craft, and indeed of navigation, perhaps watching the stars, but possibly even language. So something exciting happens around about 1 million years ago in Southeast Asia. Somebody figures out how to get across to Flores. Now Flores takes about 6 journeys by water, one of which is almost sort of 90 kilometers. So these are quite significant water crossings that are involved. Now on Flores, bones have been found which suggest that these hobbits were present at least 700,000 years ago. We can't conclusively say that the earlier tools, the million-year-old tools, belong to the hobbits. They may belong to Homo erectus, or even to another hominin that's in the area that we don't know of yet. But certainly we know that by 700,000 years ago, we've got the ancestors of the hobbits present. We know this because the fossils are of very small adults. And then we find another catch of these fossil bones in a cave dating to between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago, which we believe is essentially the time that these hobbits began to extinct, and that by around 50,000 years ago they've gone extinct. So that's the current understanding. But what really interests us here is the fact that we have hominins, early humans, really so close to Australia that it's, we can call it spitting distance, that it's long been understood in the stories of human evolution and human migrations that once humans cross the Wallace Line, it's inevitable they will reach Australia. And indeed, it's always been understood that in the later modern human migrations, that as soon as humans had figured out a way to get from mainland Southeast Asia across the Wallace Line, that they then entered Australia. And this is well understood. So there's no particular reason to think that this shouldn't be then attributed to this same understanding attributed to these early hominins, that if they can somehow get to Flores and get to the east of the Wallace Line, there's every reason to think that they should then end up in Australia. Now this gives us the possibility of an early hominin group entering Australia 1 million years ago, or soon after. which is quite revelatory in itself. And people say, but where are all the bones of these early hominins? And that's when we have to really remember here that yes, indeed, that sea levels do change, and as we mentioned earlier, 100-meter change has happened. So we have to understand that wherever these early humans landed in Australia, those parts of Australia are now deep under the sea. An enormous part of Southeast Asia and Australasia, was lost to the sea at the end of the last ice age, what we call the rapid warming period, after the last glacial maximum. And there was about a third of the land in that region has been lost, a vast amount of land. We'd understand, we can imagine that most of the landing sites, are now deep underwater. So unfortunately, it's not as easy to say that, oh, well, the bones aren't, readily visible, so it didn't happen. Just because they're not readily visible doesn't mean that they're not there. I mean, unless we do a lot of, undersea, archaeology, then we can't really discount that at all. I mean, the logic says that we've crossed the Wallace Line, they should be in Australia. And then we come back to another issue here, which is the Denisovans. Before anyone sort of says, well, hang on a minute, what else? What other evidence is there for this? Well, the Denisovans provide this additional evidence, because you have to go back now and remember that the only place that has a high signature of Denisovan DNA is to the east of the Wallace Line, and particularly in Guinea and northeast Australia. Now that's pretty mind-bending for the consensus academics. There's been a lot of head scratching going on because everyone sort of thought that the Denisovans were a Central Asian species, and yet there is no genetic signature in Central Asia for them. So if there was a vast population there, we should see that signature. We should see interbreeding between the local, modern humans and the Denisovans. We don't see that. We don't see it anywhere else except for really down into across the east of the Wallace Line. The Guineans and the northeast Australians have up to 6% DNA from Denisovans. Now that's quite a lot. When you think about that, the Neanderthal trace in our DNA is only around 2 to 3%. So we know there had to be considerable interbreeding between the modern humans and these Denisovans. There must have been a fairly sizable population, at least relative to each other, a fairly sizable population of Denisovans alongside the Homo sapiens. And we would, if we imagine that interbreeding wasn't common, only a certain proportion of any group was going to interbreed, but there had been fairly significant sized populations rubbing up against each other to have this kind of level of interbreeding. Now this is goes on to another problem, because the understanding of the populating of Australia, is that around 50,000 years ago, fully modern humans had expanded out of Africa and had ended up, all the way down into Southeast Asia. And there's a couple of different models for migrations, but one of the models is basically that humans came out of Africa, they moved along the coastlines of Asia, made their way down to Southeast Asia, and then crossed the Wallace Line, entered Australia, and began to populate Australia around 50,000 years ago. With this being a one-off event, and that after that the population in Australia became isolated, and were isolated for tens of thousands of years. So if we take that face value, then 50,000 years ago, a small group crosses into Australasia and is then isolated, and yet the interbreeding between Denisovans and Homo sapiens is considered to have happened 44,000 years ago. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't see a way that two groups can interbreed without being in the same land at the same time. Sounds stupid, but this is the argument that's being made at the moment, is that that we have this interbreeding, and yet Homo sapiens are alone in Australasia from 50,000 years onwards. So it doesn't make sense. We have to reevaluate this. For this to have happened, as the scientists are telling us, the Denisovans have to have been on Guinea, and at the time Guinea was not a separate island. We are talking about a singular landmass, what is called Sahul, or the Sahul plate. Australasia was largely a singular landmass. Now today we see islands around the coast of Australia, and we see Guinea, but if you take the sea levels back to how they were 50,000 years ago, it's very different. So we have basically a single landmass occupied by at least two human groups. and not just two modern human groups, but two, what's considered to be two separate species. And there's some very, in that in itself, obviously, has to make us, abandon part of the consensus model. We can no longer believe in this, 50,000-year entrance with isolation. We have to accept there were people there. If the Denisovans were there, how did they get there? Now that the scientists are saying, well, maybe they sailed in, but we see no signature for them elsewhere. We don't see them rubbing up against people, whether from Africa to Europe, through Asia. The signature is only there in Guinea and Northeast Australia and parts of Southeast Asia, Indonesia. So this seems to be in their territory. There's every reason to believe that this is their territory, that that Homo sapiens are living alongside them in their where they consider to be their homelands. Now, the question here is whether or not Homo sapiens have entered Denisovan territory, or Denisovans and Homo sapiens are both living in the lands of their ancestral populations, i.e. that both have come from these original hominin migrants 1 million years ago, and that these have gone on to produce separate types of Homo sapiens. And I say that because if they can interbreed, then they are all separate types of Homo sapiens. They're not completely different species. These are what you'd call subspecies, of the ancestral population, and they're still able to interbreed. Neanderthals can interbreed, Denisovans can interbreed, Homo sapiens can interbreed. So we're talking about essentially 3 forms of Homo sapiens. And some scientists will agree with this. They say, Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, Homo sapiens denisova, and Homo sapiens sapiens. That we are the 3 cousin species that are known, and these are not the only ones. I mean, there's evidence now that there were other forms living alongside. Particularly in Guinea, we know now that the population there carries traces of another Denisovan-like species in the genome. So yet another species in this area. So it becomes very peculiar that you find now that this is the only place on Earth where we are finding, the traces of so many human forms together. The people there are carrying Neanderthal, Denisovan, another species, and of course our sapiens DNA, a real hybrid race. So why is it happening down here? If Africa is where all the action is, and all of the important stages are supposed to be happening there, why is it we don't see this in Africa? We don't see it in Europe, we don't see it anywhere else. We only see it down here in Australasia. Right, and this is really peculiar, and we already see this evidence is flying in the face of the understood models. And there's some other things we need to understand here as well, because the populating of Australia doesn't make much sense, because 50,000 years ago they entered, and then it used to be that they slowly made their way around the coasts, and then they entered into they got to the south and then entered into the continent. It took about 20,000 years. Now, because they found evidence of modern humans all the way down in the south and in the interior up to 50,000 years ago or more, saying that we entered the continent, ran around the coast, populated the island, populated the massive land mass in about 1,000 years, and then ran into the interior. It doesn't make sense. It makes much more sense to say that we've been here longer, that there was modern humans here for a longer time. And indeed, there are sites. There's a fossil site in Port Macquarie. They found the remnants of cooking fires dated to around 80,000 years. There's evidence of fire stick farming, burning to make farmlands, going back over 130,000 years ago in the interior. There is evidence there that supports this earlier populating of the landmass. But indeed, I say that what you don't find is really the evidence that these people have come in 50,000 years ago, or indeed have come in at any point after that 1 million years ago entrance. So this is a revelationary way of looking at this model. Now, the populating of the rest of the planet comes a bit later. Well, earlier than the 50,000 years ago, but later than the 1 million years ago. What we see is, of course, we've seen in Africa there are Homo sapiens going back perhaps 300,000, 200,000 years ago. I don't argue with this. I would say that from 1 million years ago onwards, or 800,000 years ago onwards, as Homo sapiens emerged in Australasia, that they also began to to migrate out. Whenever the climate suited well, or certain pressures, environmental pressures came about, small migrations happened, and that groups of early Homo sapiens made their way into Asia, and some of them would have found their way into Africa eventually. I think that migrations from Australasia, have been happening since that early point, sporadically. And that 200,000 years ago was one of these migration events where we see the Homo and Hirto skulls only in East Africa, an entrance point, very near to an entrance point into Africa, the Bab el Mandeb Straits. And indeed, that's where you'd expect to see evidence of an entrance into Africa. It's where we see two of the oldest fossils of Homo sapiens in Africa. Even the skulls found in Morocco, Morocco is an entrance point if you're coming across from Spain. Or of course, if you're coming in from East Africa and moving westward, northwest, then it's quite possible that they, moved further into the continent there. What we haven't really seen is these, Homo sapiens remain spread across the whole of the continent. So it's peculiar that we see them near entrance points. Now, the next crucial part of this, of course, is the populating of the planet, with Homo sapiens moving into all of the land masses. Now, there's two stages to this. 74,000 years ago, we see a crucial event, which is the explosion of the Lake Toba supervolcano. Now, this is down in Indonesia, and you see this enormous event, basically rocks the world. It's the largest eruption in the last 2 million years. It spreads, a huge amount of ash gas, lava, toxic gases. Enormous impact on the local environment, the climate, and then from there the ash cloud spreads to the northwest until it encircles the entire northern hemisphere of the planet, causing rapid cooling and the acid rain and deflecting sunlight. So you see die-off of plants, you see poisoning of water, you see a huge cataclysmic destruction event. Now, right in the middle, this is right in the middle of an area that I see as being inhabited by a large number of humans, a very large number of humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo sapiens. This is, on the equator during the Ice Age. This is prime real estate. This is like, people look for a Garden of Eden. This is the Garden of Eden because, beyond there is the cold lands to the north and to the south. If you're living on the equator, you're really in the best part of the world at that time. So to have the volcano off there is horrific because so many people have been clustered there, and the immediate effects, would have devastated anyone, for a good couple of thousand miles would have been, you would have been in a lot of trouble, as the acid rain approaches and the dust clouds roll over. So those who survive, you only have a couple of options. Like if you're on the southern side of the explosion, of course, you need only retreat a little to the south because the ash cloud and most of the effects are heading northwest. So if you're in Australia, you're basically okay. Now, if you're out in Asia, anywhere in Asia, across to Europe, even to the Middle East, you're going to see some severe effects. Now, over in Africa, there's survival zones from equatorial Africa down to the south. Northern Africa would have been impacted quite badly, but people there would have needed only to have headed south. As long as they could have moved fast enough, as long as you're not in the far north of Africa, a large number of people could enter the survival zones. So Southern Africa, great place to be. Australia, great place to be. Africa has an advantage in that equatorial Africa was still viable, whereas equatorial sort of Southeast Asia was right next to the volcano, the volcanic immediate effects of the volcanic eruption. So I mean, the Africans were at advantage, and it's then we see this skewed diversity amongst humans emerge, because people say to me, well, why is it that Africans have a higher level of diversity than people in Australasia and Southeast Asia? If this is where all the evolution was happening, why is it we see greater diversity amongst Africans? I say, well, look, the Africans didn't get obliterated by a supervolcano. This is a bit of, you've got to apply some common sense here. That when you look at that and you look kind of at the kill zone of this event, it's no wonder that Southeast Asia lost a high degree of diversity and sees a preservation of a small snapshot of the genetic diversity that was there. And then after this, there's a period in which basically you can't really move around in the northern hemisphere much. There's a few pockets of survivors that make it. You know, we know that Neanderthals weathered the storm in Europe. They didn't seem to have done so well in Asia. I think most of the Asian Neanderthals and the Denisovans have, you know, been obliterated. But we do see pockets of survivors in the Middle East, and, you know, in some areas that are, you know, just about viable, still quite extreme. And at this stage, you know, we're being told that, you know, humans are moving out of Africa. 70,000, you know, around 70,000 years ago to 74,000 years ago, there's a migration out of Africa, which makes no sense because the climate is in absolute, you know, turmoil. There's, you know, devastating effects, a huge drought in the Middle East. You know, it's the worst time. You know, even paleoclimatologists are saying this is the worst time for humans to migrate into the Middle East and to try and, you know, enter into the rest of the world from Africa. It makes no sense. You know, they're in a survival zone. So what makes sense is people that have fled from Asia heading into Africa. And indeed, at 74,000 years ago, roughly then, we see the appearance of a new haplogroup, what they call L3, emerges into Africa. Around 74,000 years ago, we see the first signs in East Africa of HGL3, which is a lineage closely related to M and N lineages, which are basically the lineages of all non-Africans today. You know, and this actually seems to move into Africa at this time, and it's well acknowledged that L3 heads westward and expands westward into Africa. You know, that nobody will argue with that. It certainly matches what we expect of refugees moving into the continent, crossing the Bab el-Mandab Straits and heading into the continent, carrying their genetic signature in amongst the, you know, the existing human and hominin populations in Africa. Now, for several thousand years, the climate is, you know, still terrible. So we don't see any great migrations out into the world until around 60,000 years ago. As the climate recovers, now we see humans starting to move around again. And there's a migration that comes out of Australasia, instead of coming in around 60 to 50,000 years ago, as some of the, you know, most of the academics are telling you. In fact, what we see is an expansion out of Australasia. Around 200 people, it's believed, basically are the ancestors of the Asians and Europeans. They move into Asia, they carry their lineages with them. We see this in both the mitochondrial DNA and also in the Y chromosomal genetic data. We see there's an expansion from Southeast Asia, moving upwards into East Asia, and eventually into Europe much later, around 40,000 years ago. We also see a migration heading towards Africa. And indeed, around about 45,000 years ago, a haplogroup U6 actually makes its way into North Africa, which is incredible because U6 emerges somewhere in Romania about 50,000 years ago, and it enters into Africa about 45 to 40,000 years ago, you know, going in the exact opposite direction that we expect if there's, you know, a large flow of people coming out of Africa. Instead, we're seeing into Africa migrations yet again. So this will be at least the fourth, you know, that we've seen just in what I've been talking about here, and I think there's many more. But then we see this is the migration that populates the planet, that, you know, from then on. And indeed, it's in this migration event that at least some groups make their way up through Eastern Asia and start to cross into the Americas. And, you know, that's a continent that you know, you'll be hearing more about in the upcoming talks. But thanks very much for listening, and I will welcome any questions from you on this, and I really hope you've all enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure presenting this material. Thank you.